Perhaps you've felt it, that inexplicable pull towards solitude when the world expects you to be seeking connection. And if you stay until the end of this journey, you'll discover why your soul might be calling you towards something far more profound than what society has taught you to crave. Today, more than ever, women find themselves caught in a paradox where the silence of the body is misinterpreted as emptiness, failure, or emotional withdrawal. But what if this silence represents the exact opposite? What if that quietude is your soul's first authentic whisper? When a woman consciously or unconsciously chooses to step away from the games of desire and the confines of superficial affection, something deeper begins to emerge from within her essence. This isn't absence, it's presence in its purest form. It's not lack, it's expansion beyond what the mind can initially comprehend. Carl Jung understood that all repressed energy finds new ways to manifest, and when the body stops being distracted by immediate pleasure, the soul finally claims the space it needs to communicate. Have you ever wondered why countless women report unexpected spiritual awakenings after periods of abstinence? They describe heightened sensitivity, vivid dreams that feel like prophecies, and intuitions so sharp they cut through illusion. This isn't coincidence. It's a calling that echoes through the chambers of authentic feminine power. The body, deprived of external touch, begins its sacred journey inward. In that long-forgotten territory, a woman discovers aspects of herself that had never been witnessed, neither by herself nor by anyone who claimed to know her. This transcends simple celibacy and enters the realm of transmutation, where energy stops seeking in others what can only be cultivated from within the depths of one's own being. Society, conditioned by models of constant sexual validation, fears the woman who withdraws because she becomes unpredictable, mysterious, untouchable. More threatening still, she begins to see beyond the games, beyond emotional repetitions, beyond the masks of relationships that imprison more than they liberate. If you felt this calling stirring within your own depths, if something in these words resonates with a truth you've been afraid to name, then subscribe now, because this channel is dedicated to exploring the profound territories of feminine awakening that most are too afraid to discuss. And together, we'll uncover the ancient wisdom that your soul already knows, but your mind has forgotten. Jung would call this an encounter with the shadow, that pivotal moment when a woman stops seeking to be chosen and begins to choose, not loving to be loved in return, but loving herself with such intensity that everything superficial dissolves on its own. There exists a kind of silence that isn't emptiness, but rather a temple where sacred transformation occurs. When the body comes to a halt, it's because the soul is about to ignite a light that disturbs the comfortable darkness of unconscious living. A woman who lives without sex or relationships isn't dead inside. She may be more alive than anyone around her dares to be. What appears as absence is actually an abundance of inner presence. What seems like loneliness reveals itself as deep communion with something no passion could ever touch. It's within that sacred space that the archetype of the wild woman awakens, the one who reconnects with her ancestral wisdom, her pure instinct, the feminine that requires no audience to validate her existence. This calling isn't for everyone. It's for those exhausted from trading their essence for moments of false connection. It's for those who understand that what they truly seek isn't in anyone's bed, but in a radical encounter with the totality of their own being. If you've followed this narrative thus far, perhaps you're closer to that journey than you realize. The body falls silent, not from weakness, but from strength, retreating to become power. When the soul begins to speak, there's no turning back, because a woman who has heard her soul will never again settle for the low volume of ordinary love. There comes a moment in every woman's life when the noise of the world becomes unbearable, not the outer noise, but the inner murmur of expectations that aren't hers, desires she was taught to feel, affections imposed as absolute truths. In that deep exhaustion, almost invisible to others, the journey back to herself begins. Jung said that everything we deny within ourselves returns as fate, and perhaps that's why, when the body chooses silence, it's not failure, but a sign that something greater is trying to emerge. The woman who begins to withdraw from impulses that once guided her, without fully understanding why, is already hearing a silent calling that originates not from flesh, but from soul. Even unknowingly, she begins to feel a longing without a name. It's not nostalgia for a man, a touch, or a passionate night. It's nostalgia for herself, for a place she hasn't yet reached, but knows exists in the depths of her authentic being. In this context, abstinence isn't punishment, but a portal. By crossing through it, she begins what Jung called the process of individuation, a radical path toward wholeness, where she abandons the projections she cast onto others in order to finally recognize herself. The emptiness that appears isn't absence, but space being prepared for something more authentic to be born. Within that space, memories begin to ache differently, not as open wounds, but as clues to a greater story. The relationships that passed, the nights that ended in tears, the cycles that repeated without explanation, all begin to make sense under new light. The woman who embraces silence isn't retreating from life. She's rewriting her own story from a completely new perspective. Her inner self begins to observe emotions as symbolic mirrors of an unconscious that had always spoken to her, but the noise of desire had silenced its voice. Gradually, she discovers that she no longer needs applause or external validation, that her worth isn't measured by how much others desire her body, but by how deeply she can hold the presence of her soul in silence. At this point, a nearly mystical force is born, the force of the woman who no longer needs to be chosen. This is where the world begins to fear her, because it doesn't know what to do with someone who has stopped begging for love. She becomes whole and therefore dangerous to everything that still lives in halves. When that woman begins to realize that her vital energy isn't dormant, just withdrawn, she enters a new state of consciousness where there's no rush and no need to prove anything. The silence of the body isn't punishment, but a language that can only be understood by those brave enough to inhabit their own depths. Jung would call this a reconciliation with the feminine unconscious, a reconnection with ancient symbols buried under centuries of repression. This reconciliation doesn't happen through words, but through presence. But the journey isn't gentle. An unease sets in, an invisible anguish that consumes from within. When a woman begins to distance herself from immediate desire, from familiar contact, from the presence of another body beside hers, she also distances herself from everything that once made her feel like she belonged. What remains initially is brutal discomfort, as if the world no longer recognizes her existence, as if her absence from the game of desire has rendered her invisible. Jung would identify this as the beginning of the encounter with the shadow, the part of herself she repressed for years, that lived in adaptation, thirsting for validation, but now refuses to keep pretending. At this point, she begins to wonder if she was wrong to walk away, if she's losing her sanity, if she's wasting time, youth, and opportunities. Society screams that a woman's time is short, that she must be in motion, conquering, being desired, fulfilling expectations, and suddenly, she no longer fits anywhere. She's no longer the lover, the wife, the muse, or the girlfriend. She is just herself, and that hurts more than any abandonment. Abstinence now begins to feel like punishment, but it's not. It's a test, a symbolic journey that only souls prepared for it can endure. Temptations arise, old patterns knock at the door, easy invitations reappear. Everything seems designed to test her resolve. The cruelest part is that no one around her understands what's happening. Friends question her choices. Family suggests she go out more, not isolate herself. But it's not isolation, it's immersion. And not everyone is ready to witness someone diving deep while the rest of the world floats on the surface. Jung saw this as an inevitable stage of individuation, the moment when the ego panics because it's losing control and the soul subtly begins to take the lead. It's in that silent despair that many give up, returning to old patterns, accepting lukewarm love, convincing themselves that having something is better than nothing. But the woman who stays, even through tears and doubt, is being shaped by something far greater than herself. She's being called to break the cycle, and cycles aren't broken by force, but by awareness. The tension she feels isn't a sign of error, but of transition. The cocoon tightens before the butterfly is born, and that's exactly what's happening. A new being is being gestated in the darkness of silence. Deep down she knows it, even if she can't explain it, even if she fears she's too alone, too misunderstood, too profound for the shallow world around her. There's a voice that doesn't shout but insists, a presence that doesn't show itself but accompanies. That presence is the symbol of the archetypal feminine, the anima that Jung described as the bridge between consciousness and mystery. It's with her that the woman begins to converse, and the deeper that internal dialogue grows, the more she understands. Her body isn't on pause, it's in ritual, a ritual the modern world has forgotten, but one her soul has always known how to walk. Then something shifts, subtly, almost imperceptibly. A new understanding begins to bloom. What once was restlessness now transforms into deeper questions. Why have I always needed to feel desired to feel alive? Why does another's absence feel so unbearable? What in me still feeds off the gaze of others to exist? The woman keeping silence isn't withdrawing from life. She's rewriting her own story from a new vantage point. The inner self begins to observe emotions as symbolic mirrors of an unconscious that had always spoken to her, but the noise of desire hadn't allowed her to hear. Little by little, she discovers that she no longer needs applause or external confirmations, that her worth isn't in how much her body is desired, but in how much she can sustain the presence of her soul in silence. At that point, an almost mystical force is born, the force of the woman who no longer needs to be chosen. The world begins to fear her, because it doesn't know what to do with someone who has stopped begging for love. She becomes whole, and therefore dangerous to everything that still lives half alive. When that woman starts to realize that her vital energy isn't asleep only gathered, she enters a new state of consciousness, a state where there's no hurry and no need to prove anything, because the silence of the body isn't punishment, but language. That language can only be understood by one who dares to inhabit her own depths. Jung would call this a reconciliation with the feminine unconscious, a reconnection with ancient symbols buried under centuries of repression. The transformation is complete when she realizes she no longer needs to be sought. She is the center, the fire, the revealing light. When that light turns on, those who cannot handle its intensity walk away. Those who come later won't approach her halfway, because the woman who has crossed through silence no longer accepts living dimmed. She's no longer available for ordinary relationships because she herself is no longer ordinary. When the body goes silent, it's the soul that chooses, and the soul once awakened never chooses what once wounded it. Then she rises, not as someone returning to the world, but as someone becoming the world. Every step is now conscious, every choice measured not by fear of being alone, but by the value of her own company. The body that once kept quiet now pulses at a new frequency, subtler, deeper, truer. There's no rush to fill emptiness anymore, no desire to fit into spaces too small for her expanded soul. Jung said that what we deny submits us, and what we integrate transforms us. This woman has finally integrated her absences, made lack her home, turned silence into an altar. She's not waiting for someone to rescue her, because the woman who has crossed through her own darkness no longer needs saving. She rescued herself, and that self-rescue changes everything. She can no longer go back to how things were. What once was need is now choice. What once was compulsion is now discernment. She can love, yes, but she no longer loves from need, but from overflow. When that love arrives, it won't come to complete her, but to accompany her. Her soul is already whole. This new state awakens something profound, a sense of mission, of purpose, of clarity. She understands that her experience wasn't just personal, but symbolic, that her silenced body represents all those women who were also taught to depend, to distract themselves, to give in. Now she feels the impulse to be a beacon, not to lead the way, but to light the fire. Only one who has found herself in the dark can teach others not to fear it. Jung would call this the manifestation of the self, when the soul no longer wants to be accepted, but expressed. Everything she lost along the way, the old loves, the fragile versions of herself, the relationships where she had to shrink to fit, no longer hurts the same. Now every loss sounds like liberation. Every absence feels like an answered prayer. The woman who went through abstinence of the flesh has found nourishment of the soul. That nourishment feeds her from within. Nothing from the outside will ever be enough, unless it resonates with what already lives inside. She prepares not to return to old roles, but to inhabit a new place in the world, a place where her presence is enough, where her voice carries weight, where her silence is sacred. When her body desires again, it will be by sacred choice, not emotional addiction. When love knocks, it won't find a needy woman, but a woman full, complete, ready. Until that happens, she remains steady, not in abstinence, but in vigil, because now she knows the body is quiet, but it's the soul that is finally speaking. There are silences that seem cold, but hold embers. There are absences that from the outside sound like loss, but within hold fertile ground. There are women who, when they withdraw from the world, don't extinguish, but ignite on another plane. When the body falls silent, it doesn't die. It becomes an altar, a sacred space where the soul finally finds courage to speak. Everything that once seemed like lack of life now reveals itself as divine presence, gestating a new identity, clearer, rarer, whole. Nothing lived is ever lost. Everything is transmuted. Desire, once urgency, becomes choice. Pain, once a wound, becomes a scar of wisdom. The woman who walks through abstinence with awareness isn't stepping away from love. She's learning to love from a place where there's no longer hunger, but abundance. In that quiet abundance, she becomes untouchable. Not because no one can reach her, but because no one can manipulate her anymore. Can you feel the reflection of this path inside yourself? The nameless nostalgia, the discomfort of no longer fitting where you once felt at home, the desire to retreat without knowing exactly why. That isn't fragility. It's the first call. Maybe this message didn't find you by accident. Maybe it's the mirror of something that has long pulsed within you, but had not yet been clearly named. Now that it has, something changed. In the end, this is what remains. A woman who has learned to hear what the soul whispers when the world is too loud. That whisper says you are not alone. You are awakening.